Well, hi everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Hi, Toby. It's Elizabeth Humphreys, based at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia.
wonderful. Thanks so much for being with us. Now, since you and I started talking but hadn't started recording, your pussycat has very elegantly leapt down from the top of your bookcase. But where that little person is now, I have no idea.
There are two of them. They're probably a bit grumpy because I've had meetings all day and they haven't had very much attention.
Hmm.
So, yeah, hopefully they won't interrupt us.
Now, Prof, I have a set of queries that I put to everybody, as you know. They're a bit stereotypical, but here they go. Do you feel ready?
Yes, go for it.
Can you share with us what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you? What's going on?
Yeah, you mentioned this question only a few minutes ago, but I have to say I've been in a phase where there is so much distressing that is happening in the world.
Hmm.
Um, Genocide in Palestine, the attacks on people in Lebanon. My campus is currently sacking staff and going through massive retrenchments, which, as I know, is a problem on campuses worldwide. I've actually been trying to avoid the real world in some ways,
Oh, yeah.
trying to, I think, uh, create space where you can kind of set aside those sorts of pressures. The particularly in Australia, we've had this racist party for some time on the rise. This is not an uncommon story internationally. And yeah, I guess my head has been switching between wanting to be in that real world, understand it, and act in that real world, and also just set aside that real world. So the thing I've been quite obsessed with is since I watched Heated Rivalry, the Canadian TV show about gay hockey players, I've really fallen into a world with some friends, other queer friends, about, I guess it's like in that show, it's a near world, right? There are issues around sexuality and being in the closet, but it's free of climate change, catastrophic, bombings, a range of other things. And so we've been quite enamored, I guess, watching the reaction of people, positive reaction of people globally, particularly in the Anglophone world, to see such open representations of queer people and queer people in sport on TV screens, which seems particularly poignant, I guess, at a moment where attacks on trans people in sport have been particularly problematic. But it's a funny world to be in, right? To be consumed by this cultural product is kind of relief from the pressures of the real world.
Point taken. Of course, as you say, this touches on very real issues, and as does much drama of different forms. But in this case, very real issues that are highly politicized, and especially in a very macho domain like hockey.
Yeah, and I'm a massive fan of something called Australian rules football. And the first ever professional player came out as bisexual last year. This was seismic, right? So it's this, a friend described Heated Rivalry as this near world, right? Where there's enough resemblance to our own world, or certainly my world, that it allows you to process and for people to process issues from their world through this more contained thing. But it's been great seeing the reaction of people in the US and Canada in particular, I think, um, to, and I'm talking particularly straight people, to the creation of space for different kinds of representation, and that's been pretty delightful. Not without its complications, of course. Nobody imagines these things are straightforward, but as somebody who has loved Australian rules football for decades, and not necessarily seen a place for queer fans to see slowly, particularly over the last 10 years, the build up of pride groups within those very masculine structures. The coming out, a women's competition started here, which is, of course, full of queer players and trans players. This, it's a very real live discussion in Australia about the limitations around masculinity in professional sport, but also the fact that there are different forms of masculinity that that people are now speaking about, I think, publicly, high-profile people in the Australian context. So, it's pretty delightful to see that when you get older, as you would know, Toby, we're both not young, but when you sort of think back how things change over our lifetimes, like that kind of delights me.
And the trans players are welcome in the women's league.
Yeah, there are two non-binary players in the Women's Australian Football League.
Yeah.
However, trans players, if they are not allowed to play at the professional level, they are at the amateur level. So I think, like in some other countries, there is a real fight happening within professional sport to allow open and full access. Things are not as difficult as in the UK and the US. In Australia, there's definitely more infrastructure and legal rights around participation, not necessarily though at the professional level in all sorts of sports.
Now, Prof, one of the limitations of living and working in the global south is that we don't have as much access to academic materials as people in wealthier countries. And this especially applies to books, and most particularly books in English. So this is my explanation, my alibi for not having read How Labour Built Neoliberalism. But it sounds as though the contents are on the tin lid, the lid of the tin. And I wonder if you would mind going through that, which I think is your first book, for listeners who may, like me, not have access. Could you tell us about how Labour built neoliberalism and what that meant? And I should say, I have been able to download a number of your wonderful pieces, including the terrific Festschrift to Frank Stillwell, which includes a lovely chapter by you, as well as a great coda by the great man. So I wondered if you could explain a bit of this in terms of neoliberalism in Australia, Labour in Australia, Labour with a U, Labour without a U in Australia. So a wee bit of a history lesson for us. Does that make sense?
No problem. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the first thing I just would say is my book is available as an illegal PDF, and I have absolutely no problem people downloading it from whichever sites they have access to. And if you can't get it, they can just email me and I will send them a PDF of it. So in it, obviously, people would be aware of the sort of global march of neoliberalism from the 1970s onwards. And neoliberalism is not path dependent. It varies across different territories and reflects, I guess, over time, a range of political factors and the balance of class forces in those countries as to what it looked like. But my book sort of establishes that there is this dominant narrative of neoliberalism, that it begins as this project of the new right that is imposed on the labour movement and on Labour, that social democratic parties really only take it up in some kind of lesser or softer form after that, and that neoliberalism is developed by the global north or economists in the global north and exported to the global south. One thing the book wants to do is kind of unsettle that global narrative. And it does it by explaining what happened with neoliberalism in Australia. It's not the only country that doesn't fit that narrative, but it's a key one. In Australia, neoliberalism was introduced by the Australian Labor Party in a corporatist or cooperative framework called the Prices and Incomes Accord, which was a social pact. And this was an agreement between the political wing of the Labor Party, the Australian Labor Party, and the industrial wing of the Labor Party, the Trade Union Federation, and in some ways in conjunction at times with industry to deliver. The main agreement is that there would be no more wage increases, that wages would be held down to help inflation, at the same time that the union would get other kind of gains. And this included a thing called superannuation, so a pensions system, and the return of universal health care in the form of a program called Medicare, which had been introduced in the early 70s, abolished by a conservative government in the late 70s, and sort of brought back online. So it's kind of this trade-off. The promise was that wages would keep pace with inflation. There would just be no increases above inflation. The Labor Party stayed in power for 13 years. They've been long out of power, during which these accords, as they were called, were introduced. However, wages didn't keep pace with inflation. Very quickly, it became a case of wage suppression that was very successful. And because these were always pegged at a percentage of people's wages, it meant people on lowest wages were held down most, right? If you earn 50,000 Australian dollars and you had a wage increase of 5%, you got much less than if you earned $100,000 and you got a wage increase of 5%. There was enormous hardship. I guess for context, like I came from a working class family. My dad worked in an oil refinery and my mum was a bank teller and many other things. The economic crises of the 1970s in Australia, there were 5 recessions in 10 years, meant, my mother and many women who would have potentially stayed at home in sort of like upper working class families were forced back into the workforce. And I had other careers before I became an academic. I worked in government oversight. I worked for student unions as a researcher and student rights advocate, and, whiled away on many hours doing activist work. But when I came to sort of want to return to study in my 40s, I guess I returned to my experience in a working class family in those times, and an unanswered question about how did this happen? How did the Labor Party come together with the trade unions to suppress wages and suppress industrial struggle at a point of the height of trade union power in Australia? So whilst there were these recessions and unsettled economic times in the 70s, like there were globally after the oil shocks and a range of other factors, Australian unions were at their peak in terms of industrial power, number of strike days that they had taken. Out of that chaos and union power and those recessions came this kind of cooperative agreement to try and, I guess, the way it was sort of framed, was going to bring Australia together in the national interest. But of course, there is no national interest. There is no cooperation in the suppression of wages of ordinary people. This is a class project to restore profitability. Now we get to see how a collective thing between the Labor Party and the trade union starts to sound like neoliberalism. It starts to sound like Thatcher and Reagan and what happened in the Anglophone world elsewhere. The imposition of wage suppression, the limitations on industrial action in order to deliver a return of profitability and a return of GDP to employers and to profit and away from wages. And so I guess that's the context in which the book comes out of studying that moment in history, but to answer a question, which is how do Australian unions go from 50% coverage of workers to 13? You know, the decimation of class power in Australia between 1983, where there's 50% of workers are in trade unions, to today, or when I wrote that book, 13%, less in the private sector, 9% in the private sector. This is a massive shift of class power. And a very real question for today, how do we deal with contemporary issues in the labour movement in the legacy and wake, I guess, of that massive reorientation of labour in the neoliberal period? The difference is it happens at the hands of the Labour Party and the trade unions. It's not imposed by the new right. And therefore, this dominant narrative about Thatcher, Reagan, Pinochet in Chile imposing these things on labour movements only, it's not the only story. There are other stories in Australia, in New Zealand, in France, in Poland, in Finland, which show that neoliberalism doesn't always have the same shape. And also, I think it writes out of the historical narrative the experience of the Global South. Not that there's even a single story in the Global South about the advance of neoliberalism. There are multiple stories. And so at the same time I was writing this, I wasn't aware that Raewyn Connell, brilliant academic, and people will be potentially familiar of her work on masculinities, right? Was also working, I guess, on projects around the knowledges in the Global South and what is actually the story of neoliberalism in the Global South. And I do think we need to unsettle that narrative, because if we don't confront the issue of how labour movements get drawn into state projects of restructuring, then we've not really learned, I don't think, in Australia and some other locations about how labour movements get incorporated or encapsulated into these projects of reorientation through the state. They start to see, unions can often think that the state is a neutral actor, I guess, in these political moments, but it's not neutral. It has its own interests. And those interests can be exercised against labour movements and progressive movements. And so for me, I guess that's the personal motivation, is really understanding what do we do now, right? And how do labour movements build independent power or rebuild independent power in places like Australia in order to address new challenges around wages, conditions, and broader political challenges.
And of course, you've also published, I see someone's tail. Hello. Hello, someone. Oh, you're so beautiful. You're so beautiful and so happy to be in your mama's arms. You've also written, of course, along with others, about how this has implications environmentally, because many of the people who've had wage theft over the last 40 or 50 years are in groups that in other ways are vulnerable, like migrants, queer people, women, and so on. And of course, lacking industrial representation can make one even more vulnerable. I wanted to ask you, though, about something slightly off to one side here, which is about transformations in economic thought, because these are pretty relevant too, aren't they? Many of the countries you've described had strong state intervention in the economy, and not just to prop up capital, but to invest, to have industrial policies, and to engage in some sort of equitable redistribution of wealth. Much of that was abandoned in the 1970s with the wholesale radicalization of bourgeois economics from a Keynesian macroeconomic perspective to a marginalist one. and also the rise of monetarism and so on. So I wanted to ask you about that and whether that was going on here and whether that was affecting the union movement in Australia. Were there, instead of everybody being the son of a miner, were these bright young men, I presume they were mostly men, coming out of economics faculties who believed in the marginalist revolution? Was that part of it?
Yeah, definitely. Like in other locations, there is this shift in universities and in within government, the policymakers in government, away from Keynesianism to neoliberal policy making, broadly speaking, monetarism. Yes, this is similar, right? In my book, and I just love Gramsci's way of putting this, but Antonio Gramsci said he's got this bit somewhere in the prison notebooks. Sorry, like the book's long, and it's a methodological question where he says, like, understanding how these things happen, right? And often Gramsci's moving between thinking about things in the specifics of a locality and global changes. He says it's about the difference and uniqueness, I think. Like the uniqueness of a location within and the similarity, right, is what he says more broadly. I think this is a really useful way to think about neoliberalism. When we examine one location, say Australia, and we compare it to the US or the UK, which is often the things that's compared to in academic work, what we're looking for is that similarity and difference. So for me, the similar things are similar shifts in the orientation of economic policy frameworks within the academy and within government, and then differences in potentially how it's implemented. So for me, it doesn't matter whether it's a new right government like Thatcher or Reagan, or a Labor government, Hawke and Keating in the case of Australia. The end point is the same. Now, this doesn't mean that the unions went into the process thinking we're shifting from Keynesianism to neoliberalism. They thought they were entering a corporatist framework. There'd been years of the trade unions sending people to Europe in particular, to Scandinavian countries, to Germany, to look at corporatist cooperative models of tripartite models between government, industry, and unions in order to deal with economic planning. They thought the Accord process was going to be a process of economic planning. I think the way that most academics and even most unionists thought about neoliberalism in Australia was you either had corporatism or neoliberalism. These were competing frameworks. I don't think that is the right way to think about things. Capitalism and policy making is part of a totality, and governments use what is fit for purpose. So what was fit for purpose to control the power of unions was a corporatist agreement to hold down wages and to basically make it illegal for unions to take industrial action, right? It was an agreement, you'll get inflation pay rises, but you take no further industrial action. At the same time, policy making is got these kind of big bang neoliberal reforms that start to happen in various countries. The Australian dollar is floated, foreign banks are allowed into Australia, privatisation happens. And this is a familiar story in all sorts of countries, you know, and the protests, say, against like the privatisation of water in Bolivia are like, you know, seismic. The protests in Latin and South America are over IMF imposed reforms and local government imposing them are huge. The thing about a corporatist agreement where you stop industrial action is you stop political resistance, really, in Australia to the imposition of these policies. the way I put it in the book is it's about a disorganization of class power by the unions involving themselves in this collaborative corporatist process. Over time, they disorganize themselves as neoliberalism advances. And so you have corporatist frameworks sort of
Yeah.
sitting inside this neoliberal advance. I think I call it simultaneous deepening corporatism and
Mm.
advancing neoliberalism. I guess there's one important thing to mention about Australia historically. Australia and New Zealand have a somewhat unique industrial system. Australia is obviously set up by the British Empire through colonies that, uh, invade and kill Indigenous people and establish capitalism on their shores through various colonies on across the country. And the country is huge, as people know. In 1900, after 125 years or so of kind of since the British invasion arrival, the colonies federate into a nation that we now call Australia. Before that, it wasn't called Australia. It was like the Swan River Colony. People who read their Marx may remember Marx talking about Wakefield and the Swan River Colony in one of the chapters. But the main populations are on the eastern seaboard, and they remain on the eastern seaboard today. When federation happens, a unique system of conciliation and arbitration is set up so that it's not like Spain or the UK even, where you have these unions that sort of exist outside state structures. Unions are always sort of partly inside these conciliation and arbitration structures. You can only represent workers if you're a sanctioned, approved of union. Things like wildcat strikes, there is a history of this, but really it's a history of being deeply involved in state legal processes. One way that it's sort of, one example of it is Australia has a lot of one-day strikes, right? They are about the withdrawal of labour, but they're also about proving within this arbitration system that unions have the power to do that. They're kind of a
Mm.
play or an example within that structure. But in the 1970s, at the peak of industrial struggle, there's one peak in about 72, 73, and there's another one in about 80, 81. Things are really going haywire. Union power is at its strongest point. There is much more happening outside of legal, sanctified strikes. So when we say corporatism, it's not just that everybody wants to get together or that they've gone to Europe and looked at alternative economic policy and alternative models. It is an attempt to bring trade unions much more firmly within the state structures again to curtail union power. And it's highly successful. The unions also, they've been absolutely battling this conservative government, the Fraser government, and sort of neither side has won. The state hasn't been able to control the unions, but also inflation and unemployment are heading to double digits. There's massive unemployment, which is rare in Australian history. That it's a country of labour shortage, right? In many ways. And so the unions are desperately looking for a way to protect unemployed members because the Australian welfare state had largely been built around the male wage. At the same time, a single male wage, I mean, built around it like there's a legal case called the Harvester Judgment, which basically said, how much does it take for one man to support a wife and two children? But if you suddenly have mass unemployment and also one male wage is not enough to support a family and you need two people at work, it's really unsettles some of the kind of presumptions about how Australian workers were going to live a good life. It's not every worker, of course. As you point out, migrant workers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers often have existed at the margins of this kind of white male wage system in Australia. But with the unions all of a sudden being filled with the ranks of unemployed people, they are looking for a solution for their members in this midst of economic crisis. So you kind of have these two things coming together. So not like the union said, yes, we need to smash worker power. However, they did enter an agreement in order to absolutely curtail worker power. And that's something that really has to be thought through, because the way that many in the union movement and academia have traditionally told this story is that this Labor government, that this kind of reorientation was the absolute high point of Labor, industrial and politically in Australia. So you have this narrative about these wonderful days of economic reform, and the neoliberalism had a name in Australia which was called economic rationalism, where we took a rational approach, we all worked together, workers tighten their belts in the interests of the nation. This is a national story of reorientation. But in practice, it is the absolute suppression of wages that do not recover in the period of the 13 years of this government, with the poorest workers' wages suppressed the most, and the absolute disorganisation of labour power. You can't just switch industrial power and political organising off and suddenly restart it 13 years later when you get a conservative government, right? These union power, education, education within learning the process of being an activist and being of the movement itself, learning how to exert its own power. These things are built up over decades, right? And so I think now, even decades after the 80s and 90s in Australia, we live with the legacy of this low level of power, and the disorganisation of the class up to today.
In one of your co-authored articles, a wonderful article, you and your colleagues write about anti-politics and anti-politics in Australia in a context that is not about the wholesale embrace of populist machismo per Millet, Trump, Farage. You may already have seen the Reform Party is triumphing in British local government elections, even as we speak, as the count goes on. Can you talk to us about anti-politics? And is this part of what you just described? Some sort of loss of engagement, of investment, perhaps of hope?
Yeah, I think, my collaborator Tad Titzer and I have written a bit about anti-politics, not just in Australia, but trying to, I guess, describe this global phenomenon, where sometimes described in the mainstream as kind of like a disengagement from politics, or a disengagement from political process. I guess how we see it and how I see it is that there has been a global process where politicians, not just politicians, but the political process itself is more on the nose. So the evidence that comes out of the UK, and I do think it fits here as well, is that it's not just everybody's dislikes politicians, right? They've been in the UK, they can use these like long-term surveys they've done with people about social attitudes to all sorts of things. The difference is people became hostile to the political process itself. So it's not that just people aren't political anymore, they're hostile to politics as it has been done. Politicians then capitalize on this phenomenon. It doesn't really seem to me to matter whether the people are on the left or the right, but there have been attempts to capitalize on this, Peter Marr calls it the void, right? In his book, Ruling the Void. On this void and hatred of the old way of doing politics rises this moment where populists and others on the left and the right can capture it. So in Spain, we see Podemos. In Greek, we've seen Syriza. These are ways of capturing that on the left. In Australia, the rise of the Australian Greens has in moments like captured this dissatisfaction with the old two-party system, Labor Party, Liberal Party, Liberal meaning conservative in Australia, between the Conservatives and Labourism, um, in order to offer something new, which is often these old politicians are in for it for themselves. We're not like them. We're going to do something different. Now, Trump does this as well. Trump, particularly in the lead up to his first election. I'm not a politician. No, he's a horrible billionaire, right? But he does present himself as outside the Republican Party. It's not just being outside the Democrats, it's outside the political establishment. At the same time, he's actually inside the political establishment, winning the Republican nomination. We see the same thing express itself perhaps in Brexit, right, in the UK, where they're able to say, paint the EU as this old way of doing politics and capitalize on people's disenfranchisement with politics as they know it, which has not delivered for decades any real meaningful change in terms of their economic situation and for others in terms of broader socio-political matters. So for me, anti-politics and populism is part of it, though, is recognizing that the hostility towards the political system itself has consequences and that individuals and parties can capitalize on that. In Australia, I mentioned the Australian Greens, but the other thing that happens is there's a mining magnate who uses his money in a bit like Trump in order to set up a party and for an election captures a huge vote. Pauline Hanson, a racist politician for several decades in Australia, there's different moments where she and her party, One Nation, have won a huge proportion of the vote. It's absolutely on the rise again now. These are different ways on the left and the right of it's not a middle ground. It's not about capturing a middle ground. It is about capturing the hatred, despondency, and inability of neoliberalism and what's come after to deliver real reform for people. After being told, if you participate in this and you do these things and we're all in this together, we're going to have this, streets paved in gold. Actually, as you know, inequality gets worse, everything gets worse. And in that tension, these things can happen. But I'd say the third part, when Tad and I have written about anti-politics, is the recognition that these populists and anti-political parties and individuals, because they're based on nothing, they're not based on a social base in society. They're not like the Labor Party, who has a social base in the trade unions over 150 years, right? They're built on a phenomenon and feeling. They're not very steady. And so you see the rise and fall of these parties, even in the case of Spain and Greece, Syriza and Podemos, who are built on more of a social base than this Palmer, this mining magnate in Australia. It's difficult for them to last. And so they do get turfed out of government or lose steam. So I guess in some ways it's a different way. Some people talk more about the rise of the far right, the rise of authoritarian neoliberalism. For me, yes, it is about, I don't disagree with people who are saying there are these more authoritarian versions of neoliberalism, but I do think they also come out of this void that Peter Mayer and others talk about. And I'm particularly talking about Europe and the Anglophone world, right? Mayer's book, Ruling the Void, is about Europe. In my work with a couple of friends in Australia, we've sort of applied Mayer's methodology to look at the case in Australia. Australia looks different. Every country looks different, but Australia has compulsory voting, right? So one way this is sort of shown elsewhere is turnout. People don't want to go and vote, right? Sometimes it's presented as people don't want to vote because they don't care. Mayor argues it's not about not caring, it's about not thinking the system could change and absolutely despising politicians and the political system. In Australia, you have to vote, you get a fine if you don't. Um, so we've looked at other ways, what else is happening? And it's the shift away from the two-party system. So in the past, the vast majority of the vote has gone to this Liberal Conservative Party and the Australian Labor Party. This has been declining over time, over decades. It predates the rise of neoliberalism. It's a long way to get to your question. Is anti-politics part of neoliberalism? This disenfranchisement and kind of undermining of the traditional democratic, social democratic ways that our global north social democratic countries have worked predates neoliberalism, but then speeds up in the neoliberal period. And now we're kind of left with a bit of a mess and a vacuum, I think, where I don't think we really live in a neoliberal policy framework anymore, right? We've had responses to the COVID pandemic and even the financial crisis before that, that involved some old school Keynesian policies. In Australia, there was pump priming of the economy. There was building of school halls and school infrastructure at every high school and primary school in the country. There was insulating of houses to deal with climate change, but as a way in which to force money and wages into the system. This is old school ways of dealing with the economic crisis or avoiding it.
Well, except if
Hugely
they'd done it
successful.
properly, they'd have built a national fast railway.
In Australia, God, this is yeah, Australia has no fast rail. But yes, there were arguments that needed to be of that scale. But it was, in some ways, like in Australia, it's kind of clever in the financial crisis, and we don't have a recession in Australia, right? During the global financial crisis, they gave every person who had paid tax in Australia the previous year, I think it was $900 to spend on whatever. They didn't care what you spent it on. I think I bought shoes, campers shoes made in Spain, out of, they just wanted money in the system as
Sure.
fast as possible. And then there were the medium term things, insulating houses. These were not unproblematic policies. Medium term things that, and then the long term things like the school halls over a couple of years. This was a classic Keynesian way of getting money into the system, using the multiplier in order to put money in the hands of that shopkeeper I bought the shoes from so that she would go and then spend that money and her wages, you know. And so I sort of, what I call it is crisis neoliberalism in the book. That we have this period of vanguard neoliberalism where these big bang reforms, foreign banks, floating dollars, privatization happen. We then have this more piecemeal neoliberalism, particularly when they're focused on microeconomic policy changes and really undermining labor in less direct ways, trying to force Australia away from state-funded universal health into the private health system. But after the economic crisis, I think what we have is a much more mixed whatever works, and the policymakers actually don't really know what will work. So we get this mix of Keynesian and neoliberal policies at the same time. I think the new hegemonic project, and I do think of neoliberalism in the vanguard period as a hegemonic project, where the state is absolutely able to lead an economic reform process in the national interest. We do not have a hegemonic neoliberal project. We have some neoliberal-ish policies, Keynesian-ish policies, but you couldn't say there is a coherent national economic strategy, I don't think, in Australia at the moment. I can't speak for elsewhere. And there's a similar reorientation going on in the US, obviously, as to what economic policy making is going to look like going forward.
Now, Prof, we haven't got a lot of time left. I wondered if I could steer us towards one of your very powerful concerns, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the impact of climate change on workers. You've published a series with colleagues of very valuable, imposing reports on these questions. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I look, I guess the funny story in this is when I was sitting in the archives doing research on the 70s, 80s, and 90s, if I saw a file that was about occupational health and safety, I looked at it and thought boring, right? I don't, I was not, I was more interested, it sounds silly, in big P, what I saw as big P politics, right? And that academics who would be interested in safety or workplace activists who were interested, they could do that, but, it wasn't for me. But once I sort of finished my book, the work on the impacts of climate change and particularly high heat and heat waves for workers, it wasn't that I suddenly thought, oh, I have something particular to offer or I should focus on the health of workers. It was, can we use climate change and the everyday experience of workers of heat as an organizing possibility within trade unions?
Mm.
Workers do need protection, right? Climate change is absolutely seismic in changing how occupational health and safety needs to be handled moving forward. But we're not in the 70s or 80s. Workplace labour power is at a very low level in Australia. And so part of the job is not just, we could have the most perfect occupational health and safety law, regulations, and code of practice in this country. It doesn't mean that workers feel confident enough to stop work when they're in danger. And so that's a problem. And so I guess coming into looking at these issues was thinking about that question of, is climate change an organizing opportunity for workers? I
Mm.
also then at the same time got caught up in the practicalities of we actually need the law and regulations and codes of practice to change, and we need more training and public awareness. And so I think I'm in this funny moment where I am kind of deep in the weeds of thinking
You're
about working
becoming
on,
a policy wonk.
well, which, I actually, before I was an academic, I worked in government oversight and investigated complaints about government departments, right? So it's familiar territory in some ways, but
Right.
um, I think the sort of lens that perhaps I bring to this question is that it's not, adaptation to climate change is not a technical problem. And the way it's approached by both academics and many scientists and many people in the movement is as a technical thing. Adaptation is a political thing.
Yes.
It matters. The state of workers' power matters. And so I guess the link between the work I did on um, neoliberalism and the labour movement, the work I am doing now on this, the work I do on the experiences of disabled academics is always coming from the place of, do workers have the ability to act
Mm.
in their circumstances, in their own interests and in the collective interests of workers? And that's the concerning thing, I guess, about climate change. And this is varied. This is varied in the workforce. So, I had this brilliant honors student, so that's a fourth year student who does this like defined project a few years back, Freya Newman. She did a survey of construction workers in New South Wales, is the biggest state in Australia, looking at the impacts of heat. And we were also even asking, this was, heading 8 years ago or something, did workers even believe that climate change was having an impact? Did they link the high heat they were experiencing um, to that? In doing that, and then afterwards, she worked as a research assistant with me, and a real collaborator. I wouldn't say worked for me, like we worked together on these projects. We started thinking about this notion of climate precarity. And independently in the UK, a few geographers were using the same phrase. Climate change impacts all workers. All work is precarious in a sense, right? We are Marxists. We don't think that, the worker that might deliver lunch and work for Uber Eats in Sydney, right, is more precarious than me. but we still both have to work, right? Marx is correct. Unless you're independently wealthy, you all have to work. And, there's no such thing as a secure academic job in Australia at the moment. As I said, dozens of people being sacked at my campus at the moment. It's happening all across the world, but it's varied. I have much more power than that gig worker, right? That piece worker delivering meals in the hot of the day. And I'm a white collar worker. When it's too hot, myself and my colleagues, or when there's a pandemic, we just lock our front door and work at home. I can avoid air conditioning on a hot day. But there are workers I've interviewed who they're called home care workers who help care for people with disabilities. They go to the houses of those people with disabilities who are on pensions that do not give them enough money to run their air conditioning in the middle of heat waves. They're disabled and already vulnerable health-wise to heat and heat waves. That the workers are then working, showering people, moving people's bodies, doing really intensive work in unair conditioned spaces. The difference between my experience of a heat wave and the experience of those workers is seismic. And so I think in terms of acting right in this world to deal with the consequences of climate change, you can't avoid the question of the power of workers in different industries. But I don't like the word vulnerability, like how vulnerable workers are. Like it doesn't sit right because those workers are vulnerable in one sense, but it doesn't allow them agency, that word,
Well,
I
and
feel like.
they're also strong. And it
Yes.
doesn't just mean that in physical terms, though that can be very true, but they're strong in coping with climate change, coping with immiseration, and coping with what can be emotional isolation, especially if they're doing care work, where
And
yes,
creative, right? The thing is, workers are already adapting to
mm,
climate change, whether it's those delivery cyclists, when we did interviews with delivery cyclists, they know exactly where in the city which foyers have air conditioning and the security won't kick them out, where the water fountains are, like up against it individually, they try and do their best to care for themselves and they're creative in thinking about how they will adapt. At times, those gig workers work out ways to self-organize, even though they're not even workers. They're under Australian law, they're kind of single small business owners, right? Contracted to provide a service to Uber.
right.
But in all that legal restriction and all that isolation, because they're not in a single workplace, they find ways, not just here in London as well, and in other locations to organise. I have a PhD student who's from Northern Ghana. His project is looking at the impacts of climate change and high heat on subsistence farmers, right? These farmers are already adapting and finding ways and trying to find ways to make sure themselves and their family members, often families working, not employees, right? To survive and live the best lives they can. And I guess in all that mess, right, to get back to where we started, in all the mess that climate change is and will create, which is happening now, it's not some point in the future. Australia went through the worst forest fires, or as we call bushfires, ever in a few years back. That for me, the Labor movement needs to take this seriously, both because it needs a higher level of organisation to protect its members, but quite simply because we have to stop people dying and getting injured, and that will be on the rise. Even in a place like Australia, with excellent occupational health and safety laws, with the kind of public health system and resources to minimise that damage from climate change, which is an absolute privilege, I know, to be able to say that, because that is not the case in many places of the world. It globally, the ILO has started, I think, to be more on the front foot about this, that this is a massive, serious problem that that all countries need to adapt to. And the union movement's interest in how that adaptation happens is not the same interest as a state. We cannot wait for our national governments to do this. Unions will have to organise. Climate change is going to get worse and deepen, and that requires us to fight every step of the way for just outcomes, for climate justice within that, recognising that it is, in the case of Australian, migrant workers on temporary visas working in agriculture or working in other systems that will be the most vulnerable. And for me, I guess, like, so I went from a position of I'm not interested in occupational health and safety to knowing that this is just something, it's one thing, not the only thing, but one thing I feel like where not enough was happening, and perhaps I could try and have an impact on shifting the discussion, let alone action on what is going to be needed in the decades going forward. And I don't feel hopeful every day. You know, like you asked me at the start what I've been doing, and I've, you know, been reading a lot of fiction and, you know, trying to not think about the real world. But that's because in other moments, I'm absolutely motivated by the implications for climate change. You know, one other example is Australia's signed this agreement with Tuvalu, the Tuvalu government, to allow migration from Tuvalu. It's the first climate migration agreement internationally. It's going to allow something ridiculous, like 200 people from Tuvalu to go into this lottery annually to move to Australia. Australia is a net producer of climate emissions. It is extracting minerals and coal from the ground, exporting it overseas. This is why we didn't have a recession during the financial crisis, because we were sending a whole lot of stuff we dug up to China that protected our economy. Tuvalu is low level, will be decimated by sea level rises. And it would take I did the calculation recently, I don't know, something ridiculous, 50 years or something for the whole population of that country to be able to move to Australia under this this lottery system. How obscene, right? How obscene to be in a country that is a net producer and as wealthy as we have, and allow this dribble in of people from that nation. And guess what? Australia even says Tuvalu, under this agreement, cannot sign like geopolitical security agreements with other nations without Australia's permission. We see climate change is leading to a new phase of colonialism, at the same, wrapping it up in this, we're going to help and save these people from Tuvalu from drowning. It's obscene, right? And I think that's why I'm saying, like, the adaptation that happens, the policy making that happens, there's going to be many opportunities for academics and others to, I guess, focus attention on drawing attention to the unequal ways that climate change is unraveling in our workplaces, through migration, you know, in the loss of rights, or the not providing of rights. And Australia, don't know, like, you probably know this, but not only is it a country founded on racist exclusionary policy making, and we used to actually have something called the White Australia policy that lasted for 70 years since Federation. But those colonial attitudes of, you know, deserving and undeserving within this globe live on, and they are already playing out and will continue to play out, you know, in migration, but also within workplaces. You know, like every Anglophone country, the workforce is segmented and racialized, and there are people at the bottom of the pile, including disabled people, migrants, who, as you point out, are often the cleverest, most able to know and then implement changes to try and protect themselves. But in a situation of low class power and low labor power, it makes it very difficult. It's not like unions are not aware of this or working on that in Australia, but there's much more to be done. Yes,
Well, Elizabeth Humphreys, I want to thank you profoundly for the wonderful contribution you've made to my understanding of so many important issues today. And I'm sure that'll be true for many listeners as well. And I think I will, come down from the mount of mansplaining and endorse your decision to enjoy some television, endorse your decision to read some fiction, because you're making an amazing contribution to popular, public, scholarly, activist understanding of a whole set of complex phenomena that, and is this hope or is this euphemism? Edgar Morin called polycrisis in 1993, and now the fucking World Bank uses the term
Yeah, I know, it's crazy, isn't it?
without, of course, acknowledging that this came from the French left. But here we
I
are,
thank
just because
you for
we
saying that. But Toby, I would say I didn't do it alone, right? That as you kept saying a few times, you and your collaborators, you and me and my honors student, right? I am I don't like working alone as an academic is one thing. I like talking to people. It's how it's not like I have some kind of perfect insight into the world. I have blind spots and weaknesses. But I do think that if academics, maybe we want to call them like public academics, people or activist academics, and like I was an activist for longer than I've been an academic, then it only happens collectively. And I've built on other people's research. I hope people find what I've written useful as a way to engage in how we're actually going to deal with um, the future in terms of climate change. Um, but not just climate justice, as my disability has gotten worse over my life, I'm more and more conscious about how how much creativity and cleverness disabled people have, and yet the social attitudes that somehow, if you're disabled, you're stupid, persist everywhere. It's about time, I think, academics also shifted their mindset to think that the repository of knowledge exists in those ivory towers. Lucky I started off in social movement studies. My master's was on the impact of the 9/11 attacks on the global justice movement, which is why I'm familiar with the IMF so-called riots and the Bolivarian water wars and things like this. Movements learn and do things and create theory and understandings of the world as much as academics. And so in that sense, I think the solidarity between academics and activists who want to act in the world, that's something that we can all work on together.
indeed. Thank you so, so much for being so generous with your time and thoughts.
Thanks, Toby.